I am very grateful for the invitation that John gave me to come and speak to all of you. And I have to say that I'm a little overwhelmed because, I mean, all of you guys are experts in the subject of Churchill. And I want to make sure that I get my facts right. So over the past few days, I have literally been doing as much homework as I can. But to be honest with you, there isn't much we know about Churchill's music. We know so much about his life, about his leadership, but like many great leaders, what inspired them in terms of music in many cases, they kept to themselves. If you put it into the context of World War II, we know what Hitler was moved by. Wagner. And I guess as a fellow anti-Semite in the case of Wagner and Hitler, they kind of connected in that regard. To the point that even to this day in Israel, Wagner is banned. It will not be played because obviously it was used for bad reasons and it brings just too many bad memories. In the case of Mr. Churchill, he liked the music hall songs, the patriotic ones. And like any great leader, he knew that the power of the lyrics and the power of that music could be utilized for purposes of getting people excited and inspired. And he used it quite well. It's nothing new. Politicians are capable of utilizing music at times, you know, and many times we relate particular songs to particular events in life. This weekend ended up happening, I think, perfectly because the National Symphony is playing, and I know many of you are coming to the performance tonight, where we are hosting at the National Symphony into the city what a collection of instruments known as the Violins of Hope, which were instruments recovered after the Holocaust from concentration camps. There is this instrument builder in Israel who's basically made his life work to collect these instruments. And each of these instruments have a story behind them, who they belong to. And in every single case, their original owners perished during the Holocaust. In many cases, the only thing that they could bring with them was maybe a little suitcase and their violins. And let's face it, the Nazis recognized when it was a Stradivarius or a Guarneri, they kept those to themselves. Because of that, many of those instruments were completely lost. That's why Stradivarius are so expensive. They're so rare. We know that during World War II, many of these very valuable instruments were lost forever by looting, just the same as any great piece of art. So these instruments are a collection of, I guess, personal violins, violas, that were used at home. Tonight, when you come to the performance, we have 23 violins being played on stage, each and every single one with a story. We have one viola, we have one cello, and also we added one string bass that was in the Krakow ghetto, and we found that kind of by accident. Apparently, some musician heard about the Violins of Hope project and said, oh, you know, my brother owns this bass that apparently belonged to a couple of brothers who were saved by Oskar Schindler. This is Nashville. It doesn't surprise me that a bass ended up in Music City. It does not surprise me one bit. So it is very appropriate that, as they say, one of the men who helped save the world during those very dark times, we are performing a concert that is bringing these silent witnesses of a very dark period in the history of time. Churchill, like most children, took music lessons. And like most children, did not like to practice. He was made to play the piano just because, for most families, that was the big piece of furniture at home. We can all relate to that. How many of us had a grandmother that had a piano, and he's like, you know, you gotta use it. It's not just for putting pictures there. You gotta play it. But apparently, I think from what I read, Mr. Churchill, it's not that he didn't like to play the piano, he wanted to play either the violin or the viola. But I have a feeling that it was mostly just to be against the father. He's like, yeah, why are you making me do this? His mom, incredibly great lover of classical music, which doesn't surprise me. A lady of society who knew sophisticated audience and wanted to pass that on to her son, who maybe was not as interested. From the very beginning, he was more interested in the whole idea of military, and playing the piano did not fit that profile. I don't know where the violin and the cello fell in. As I said, I think it was mostly to go against the mother's wishes. The music halls, to me, are fascinating. I had to go and research what they were. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but I guess with the advent of cinema, those started going away. But they must have been a lot of fun. From everything I've read, people would come in and you would hear music, and of course, especially during World War I, they became a great part of helping recruit and even sell war bonds, and very patriotic. And you can see where Churchill became completely enthralled by it. And I guess the collection of songs available in music halls were unlimited. Can you imagine remembering all of the songs and the lyrics and the text? Well, apparently Mr. Churchill did. He had a very prodigious memory, and he could remember even in old age, and he will give you the text and the lyrics and sing every single one of these songs. It shows you that these had an impact on him and stayed with him for his life. I'm sure many of these texts inspired some of his own writing, some of his own speeches. Gilbert and Sullivan, of course. Ginger Rogers, of course. The only classical music I found, or we found, and thanks to Don and to John for pointing me in that direction, is the stuff that was used for his funeral. Operation Hope Not. What is it, 12 years of planning? After one of his major strokes in 1953, they said, oh, we better start planning his funeral. Well, everybody else kept dying except him. Apparently, who was the quoted that said, all the pallbearers are dying? And he kept outliving all of them. But for 12 years, the planning of this, the funeral of this incredible man who changed the world, the Queen herself said, we got to plan something befitting of this figure. So along with some music hall songs, some classical music was chosen as well. They all have one theme: funeral music. I was actually asking Don whether Churchill himself might have had something to do with the actual choosing of the music, and you believe that he probably did. Maybe he had some input in it. Again, 12 years of planning on this, with people in and out, and like I said, people dying in the middle of the process. But in the end, they did find the music that was appropriate. And as I said, all of this music has reconnected to events in history. And I'm sure for many people at the time who attended the funeral, they were always connected. We think of John F. Kennedy's funeral, the Barber Adagio for strings. That's kind of the piece of mourning that we use in the United States. In Britain, and I was surprised of this, the main piece they use is the Nimrod variation from the Enigma variations of Edward Elgar. But that's not on that funeral. They did not use what I would say the father of 20th century English classical music. Something on the side, Nimrod, by the way, it's Elgar used to like mysterious messages, hidden messages in his music. And all of the variations, by the way, each and every one of them has they have subtitles, because every single one of them is associated to a friend of his. The first variation is his wife, and they have just the first letters of their names. So all of the variations are associated with somebody that Elgar knew. There's one variation, by the way, that has 4 asterisks. Mystery person. Now we know it's Lady Mary Liddon, who was a good friend of Elgar. Elgar loved the company of beautiful women, but he was always faithful to his wife. But Lady Mary Liddon was going to Australia at the time of the composition. She was at sea, and he didn't get her permission to put her name. And at the end, of course, she said, of course you could put my name, but the piece had been published, and forever it remained an asterisk. But we now know who it is. Nimrod, this beautiful slow movement, actually Nimrod is a mythological character, great hunter from mythological times. And his publisher's name was Andrew Jaeger. Jaeger in German means hunter. So these are the types of things that Elgar liked to add. But going back to Mr. Churchill, one more thing that I like to connect, other than the fact that I love to smoke cigars. This has become my middle-aged cry, and I'm grateful to my wife for being patient. I normally try to do it 3 or 4 times once a way, but every now and then I do enjoy it. So whoever's in charge of cigars for the society, please keep me on your list. I am grateful for all of the goodies that I get from time to time. And unlike Mr. Churchill, I do smoke the whole thing. I learned that from John. In any case, one thing also that I connect with Mr. Churchill is that from a speech he gave in his school, when he went to school, he wanted to play the timpani. He mentioned that the kettle drums attracted him. Maybe it was because it could be really loud. I used to be a percussionist myself. I always say that I moved from the back of the orchestra with 2 sticks. I'm in front now with 1. I made quite the transition. And as I said, musically, it doesn't seem that Mr. Churchill had much interest in the high classical, operatic. It was more simple. And I think that's what maybe in many cases connected him to people. He spoke their language. One of my favorite things that I always read about him is that this was a man that utilized the English language and turned it into a force for good. The way that the words that he used and the way that he delivered them really rallied not only a country, but I would say an entire hemisphere, against dangers. And to this day, we use many of those as examples and as inspiration. So going to the funeral of Mr. Churchill, we have a few of the examples of the music that was used. The Death March from Seoul, which is actually an oratorio that Handel wrote. Handel was German, but he had his greatest successes in London. Of course, the greatest piece he wrote for the British audience was Messiah. And the fact that all of these were actually written with English text. So I think it is very appropriate that this music, which I think has a very, suggestive title, it's actually from Old Testament, biblical times. And this is music used in the oratorio for the funeral of Saul and his son Jonathan. So do we have the example of that? Not really. You know what? Just turn it off. I'll tell you a little bit about it. The music, of course, is all very slow, very appropriate for this event. I have a feeling he didn't choose this one. Even for connoisseurs of classical music, Saul is a very obscure oratorio. From Handel, we know Messiah, we know water music. I would be very surprised if you knew that Handel even wrote this oratorio. But it sets the tone. And in the end, that's what we're looking for. The next one, what else do we have? What's the second?
Hang on, we're working on sound.
Okay. There we go. Getting better. And I can tell you that's not the original. That's actually the Stokowski orchestration. The original is probably for like the Handelstein, it's a very small orchestra. You all know the name Leopold Stokowski, Fantasia. He was a great orchestrator, and he loved to rewrite, particularly the music of Bach, the toccatas and fugue for organ. He would rewrite them for 20th century large orchestra, and made them very popular. Of course, you probably know also the cartoon of Bugs Bunny at the Hollywood Bowl having a fight with Giovanni Jones, the tenor. And then he walks in dressed and the orchestra goes, Leopold, Leopold, Leopold. Stokowski. So it's appropriate that this is, I guess, this music written by somebody that moved and made his career in Britain, talking 18th century, middle 18th century. So the next example, you want to play the next example? Some of the other music. Oh, that's Leopold. He had the hair. Oh, Chopin, yeah. This one I have a feeling he might have known. The Funeral March from Chopin, which is actually part of a larger sonata that Chopin wrote. But I have a feeling when you're learning piano, this is a piece that you encounter because it's relatively easy. One of the most famous tunes. And I will tell you, many people don't realize that it's Chopin. Chopin himself died at 32. Very young, always very sick. Unfortunately, dealt all his life. He eventually died in Paris of tuberculosis. He wrote that for himself. And the reason why I think Churchill might have known this tune is that when you're learning piano as a young player, it is a piece that is not too hard. It's one of the first pieces you play, which I also, for some kids who don't like to practice, this is maybe the perfect thing for you. And they may play it with a lot of gravitas. Set the speed of how the casket should be moved. You always have to think of that when you conduct this music. When you see a funeral march, whether it's Beethoven's Eroica or Chopin or the Death of Saul, you always have to. God knows I've had more than a few critics say, well, has he ever been to a funeral? It comes with age, I think. Notice that with time, my tempos have gotten slower and slower. I think it's also the result of having teenage daughters. Everything is now, I take my time. And you play the next Oh, Beethoven. Old musicians, old great artists had, of course, fixation of some sort with death. Almost every major composer wrote a piece that dealt with the subject. They seem to believe that artists somehow have this almost telepathic way of knowing as artists. Mahler had it, Gustav Mahler. They were superstitious in many cases. This one is from Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica. Originally called the Bonaparte Symphony. And then Bonaparte declared himself emperor. Beethoven, who was a great believer in the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, the idea of this man turning into a tyrant just completely destroyed him, to the point that in the score, which you can see, the original manuscript in Vienna is ripped, where Beethoven got so angry that from erasing Napoleon's name, the page ripped. He was absolutely beyond, so he changed the name, called it the Eroica, the Heroic Symphony, in memory of a great man. Him, this man had already died. The funeral march became even more, which is the second movement, became even more poignant. But the whole idea was to celebrate Napoleon. Remember, this was also around the same time that the French had Vienna under siege. And Beethoven had to be in his bed with his pillow over his head, hearing the cannons rain onto Vienna. But you can see why he changed his mind about the French at the time. For a piece that was written in 1808, the Third Symphony, this second movement is about almost 18 minutes long. That's as long as most Haydn symphony. It tells you that Beethoven was moving in romanticism was becoming the norm. Classical period of Mozart was disappearing, much darker. I can see Mr. Churchill enjoying this. There's a middle happy section. It does have, there's a maggiore section, a major key section, but most of it is in minor. Which is the next one? He always looks so serious. Reminds me of this guy. Stern look. Well, Beethoven was going deaf all his life. And like most people maybe felt that things would turn out okay. They didn't. There was always hope. He knew there was something wrong. Felix Mendelssohn. Another composer who died early 30s. Came from a very wealthy family. His father was a banker. His sister apparently was more talented than him. Fanny Mendelssohn. I have a feeling that at the funeral they played this on the organ at the church. Mendelssohn was one of the first composers turned conductors. He invented the idea of the traveling guest conductor. At a time when conductors basically stayed with their city, he was wealthy enough to travel the world. He wrote the Scottish Symphony, the Italian Symphony, the Hebrides, from visits that he made at a time that traveling was so difficult. He was music director in Leipzig at the Gewandhaus, an orchestra that still exists. But liked to guest conduct and go to conduct in Berlin and in Dresden. At the same time, composer. Became friends with Goethe. It was very, because of his family connections, knew all the great writers, great painters of his day. But like Chopin, his health was not the best. And all through his life, he dealt with constant illnesses, to the point that, as I said, in his early 30s, he passed away. Something that fascinates me about Mr. Churchill and music is that when I was reading about his early life, he was quite a well-traveled man, going to really exotic places. Cuba, India, Sudan, Egypt, South Africa, places that are rich with musical heritage. And somehow, in anything that I've read, I don't see that any of that cultural impact in those places had any effect on him. On his taste of music or on his taste of literature. He was very down the line, very British, I guess. That in all of these visits, and in some cases spent months in some of these places, have the opportunity to maybe even be influenced. God knows these composers were the ones who traveled. I mean, they put some of the local music into their compositions. I guess that's one of the things about colonial times. I mean, you're there for different reasons, you know, as he was. But still, as I was reading this, I was trying to find what in his life might have been influenced, at least culturally. We know historically he did. It shaped his view of the future. You know? And he saw that change, I think, in his lifetime in a way that yeah, it must have affected him. How Britain changed so much from being this great colonial power in the late 19th century and then going through both world wars. Maybe that history is what really helped him, you know, make the right decisions shaped by events that he himself witnessed. But music was definitely not one of his main interests. It was not. Unless it served a purpose. Unless it served a political or a recruitment or a patriotic purpose. And in that purpose, I think he was incredibly successful. He knew, he recognized how to move people's emotions. The music halls, well, are there still even, they're disappeared basically. We don't, do we have anything resemble, maybe one in London that you could maybe remember?
It used to be, and then
they just completely gone.
Yeah.
Did he like cinema, by the way?
Oh yeah, loved it.
Yeah.
Loved it.
He wrote movie scripts.
That I did know, yeah. Okay, my lord. Well, where did he find the time?
Didn't sleep very much.
Yeah, well, and that, I guess not having to smoke all of those cigars completely, that'll help. You know, I need to learn that too. Maybe as I get older, I may need to. Maybe just, what is it, half that he smokes? About? Music is great. Any questions, any comments that you may have?
They all said Funeral March. Did they all name it that? Or
No.
You just did that for a drill?
No, some of them, the second movement of the Beethoven, it's not called Funeral March, it just sounds like a funeral march. It's just called Adagio in the movement. In the case of the Chopin, it is a funeral march. He called it that. It's part of a sonata, and the third movement is a funeral march. In the case of Mendelssohn, it is also called a funeral march, but it's part of a larger piece. And I think composers also wrote this music in many cases, because that's a subject that we can all relate to, unfortunately. You know? So what better way for composers than to write music that we can at least we understand the subject. We don't like to talk about it, but that's one thing that connects us all. You know? Yes, sir.
It would be interesting to see what was played at President Kennedy's funeral 2 years before, because those two funerals were great funeral events.
Well, I can tell you, the Barber Adagio for strings was played, which, by the way, we're doing tonight at our concert. The Barber Adagio for strings, like I said, it's kind of like America's, that's the morning piece. That's the piece we use for our events. We actually do borrow the Elgar Nimrod variation. We do borrow it from time to time. I remember when Kenneth Schermerhorn passed away, I was here, I never got to meet the man. And because the Enigma variations were written by Elgar for his friends, it's a piece that a lot of times we use to honor our friends and colleagues. And although I never met Mr. Schermerhorn, we felt for the concert that I conducted the week after he passed away, this was incredibly appropriate to just play this music from the musicians to, you know, their colleagues. They also played, interestingly, at the JFK's funeral, the Adagietta from Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which you may know from the movie Death in Venice. Yeah, which actually is not really a sad song. It's actually a love letter that Mahler wrote to his wife Alma.
Absolutely.
It's just a beautiful, but it is kind of melancholy, so you can see where it connects. Leonard Bernstein, by the way, conducted the funeral service of JFK. Of course, he was close to Jackie. And one thing we do know that in both cases, the Adagio for strings and the Mahler, we know that are probably the longest performances that were ever made of those pieces. He really stretched the tempos to a point of almost making the pieces unrecognizable. The Adagio for strings is about 9 minutes long, a normal performance. From what I understand, Bernstein took almost 15 minutes. And the Adagio and the Adagietto from Mahler, which normally takes, again, about 10 minutes, about 15 or 16 minutes. I guess when you play them on their own and for that particular case, and I'm sure Mr. Bernstein must have been very moved, maybe he just could not even move conducting-wise, so the music just kept getting slower and slower. But yeah, I think in so many cases music can be so healing, not only for the people that attend the funeral that were in mourning, but at the same time it's a great way to also make that transition and into celebrating a person's life. And I think that's very important. Yes?
Maestro, I have a question about the sequencing of the music.
Mm-hmm.
What was chosen for the procession, entry into the...
Is that how you
into the
have
church?
it there?
Is that the proper
Well,
sequence?
I don't know, but I think so, because they
Yeah.
had it off the program.
Yeah, so it was from the program. So as we saw it, at the first tune we had, they were moving him up St. Paul's Cathedral. So each of these, and knowing how this planning went on, I know that down to the second almost, they had this thing planned of who was going to sing where, who was going to play when, who was going to move. It was absolutely incredible. And I mean, imagine planning something for, 12 years. And I can only wonder what Mr. Churchill thought of all this. That this is being planned. I mean, I just gotta wonder what must have gone through his mind that this was going on.
He said he wanted a lot of bands.
Well, and he got them.
You got variations.
And he sure did. Listen, you want to talk about going out with a bang? He did. And the pomp and circumstances that were really expected of such a great figure. I myself started my career as a band conductor. In Costa Rica, we didn't have military. We didn't have an army. We have remnants of what used to be military bands, and my first job was doing protocol stuff. So whenever an ambassador or president would visit the country, there I would be conducting the anthem. I was there early 90s, by the way, where after the fall of the Soviet Union, there seemed to be like a new country appearing every day. And we would be starting, Costa Rica would have relationships now with Slovakia. And now we would have relationships with Slovenia. And there were no anthems. So all of a sudden we actually had a full-time arranger in the band that we would get from the embassy the piano version of the anthem, and in a couple of hours he had to rewrite it for a full band. The one I remember the most though, we started diplomatic relationships with Malta. Yeah, I'm sure the Costa Rican society in Malta must have asked for this. And I was the music director of the band, and they said we're going to, and they actually sent this, just the text of the anthem with this little one line what the melody was like. And thank God for our wonderful arranger. He literally in a couple of hours rewrote or wrote his own version of the Malta anthem. And I just remember conducting this, and the Maltese ambassador just standing there with this look on his face. We might have created a diplomatic incident, but we did survive. But bands are the best way to do it. And coming up, Easter week is coming, of course. That was our biggest time of the year for the band, because we used to play all of the church services, and then when we had the procession with all of the saints and everything, there's the band behind it. And yeah.
That was the cause of the first Maltese-Costa Rican War.
Yeah. You know what? I might have been the first casualty of that if that would have been the case. So fortunately, it didn't go much to that. But in any case, it is really for me a pleasure to get a chance to speak to all of you. And I know many of you hopefully will attend tonight's performance, and I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Stay here. I would just a quick couple of anecdotes myself. He loved, of course, band music, and you heard the dirges, and I was hanging on to the line there in Trafalgar Square at the funeral and watched it come up Whitehall and keep on going down the Strand, and the slow march and the drum beat was incredible. It was like grabbed you, certainly grabbed me. Here I am, a pipsqueak in medical school, this is amazing to me. Then of course, on top of that, he had this sort of sense of what he loved to hear. So he chose every one of the hymns that was sung in St. Paul's Cathedral, very specifically, and so he had a sense about what kind of music he really, really liked. Gigi, look, thank you so very,
Thank you,
very
John.
much.
It's a
And
pleasure.
since we learned that you have trouble with one button, we have brought you a book, Maestro and their Music, The Art of the Alchemy of Dog Conductor. We figured you finally figured out.
Oh my Lord, you know what? I may need to read this ahead of tonight's performance.
It was so designed.
So that's how it goes. Floor,